Powder River Country, Wyoming, 1886. While neighboring ranchers threw up standard 12 by 16 log cabins in 3 weeks flat, Norwegian trapper Lars Nilsen was still digging in late September. 8 feet down into a south-facing hillside. His neighbors called it insane. They called him a grave digger. He built a roof buried under 3 feet of packed earth and sod, while everyone else trusted single-wall logs and shingles. He positioned his floor below the frost line, at nearly 7 feet deep, while others built on grade. He spent 2 months on what they finished in 3 weeks. Then January 1887 arrived. The legendary big die-up winter hit without warning. 16 inches of snow in 16 hours, temperatures plunging to 46 below across the northern plains. Standard cabins failed. Families found frost coating their interior walls 3 feet from roaring stoves. But that insane burrow? With no fire burning, it held 35 degrees when outside air hit 10 below zero, a 45-degree advantage that saved lives when conventional wisdom froze solid. What did he understand about the steady 50-degree temperature beneath the frost line that everyone else missed? And how did his excessive underground construction become the difference between survival and death during the winter that ended the open-range cattle era? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The mercury thermometer nailed to Caleb Morgan's cabin post read 10 degrees below zero on that January morning in 1887, but inside his single-wall log structure, even with the stove crackling since before dawn, the temperature barely reached 20 degrees. Frost coated the interior walls 3 feet from the fire. His wife Emma wrapped their youngest in every quilt they owned, her breath visible in the lamplight as she fed kindling to keep the flames alive. Down the valley, other homesteaders faced the same brutal arithmetic: thin walls, leaky chinking, and wood stoves fighting a losing battle against Wyoming wind that cut through gaps like frozen knives. 800 yards up the south-facing slope, Lars Nilsen stirred his coals in what the neighbors had mockingly called the badger hole. His thermometer, hung on the back wall of the dugout, read 35 degrees. No fire had burned in his small iron stove for 6 hours. The room held steady at a temperature 45 degrees warmer than the howling air outside, sustained entirely by the hill itself. 18 months earlier, when Lars first staked out his 12 by 14-foot rectangle against the hillside, the local ranchers thought he'd lost his mind. While they raced to complete standard cabins before the first snow, rectangular structures with 7-foot walls, single-thickness logs, and simple shingled roofs, Lars was still surveying the slope in late September. He walked the contour with a homemade level, checking drainage patterns and marking the precise southern exposure that would capture winter sun. The site had to shed water naturally, sloping away from the back wall toward the entrance at a gentle 2% grade. Caleb Morgan, whose own cabin went up in 3 weeks of hard work and hired help, rode by regularly to watch Lars dig. "You planning to hibernate in there like a bear?" he called out one morning, watching the Norwegian immigrant move wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of earth. Lars would pause, wipe sweat from his forehead, and continue carving into the hill. He cut the floor down 6.5 feet below the original surface, well beneath Wyoming's average frost depth of 4.5 feet, reaching the earth layer that stayed above freezing even when surface temperatures dropped to 40 below. The knowledge driving his seemingly excessive construction came from sources his neighbors had never bothered to consider. 3 winters earlier, while trapping along the Missouri, Lars had sheltered near a Mandan earth lodge during a February blizzard. The circular structure, framed with cottonwood posts and covered with several feet of packed sod, housed 2 families comfortably while his canvas tent froze solid outside. He watched smoke curl from the central opening, noted how the thick earthen walls stayed dry inside, and learned that indigenous builders had solved the problem of prairie winter survival centuries before European settlers arrived. His father Anders, who had immigrated from coastal Norway, had taught him about turf-roofed buildings that hugged the landscape instead of fighting it. Stone foundations, thick walls, and sod coverings 3 feet deep weren't architectural curiosities. They were practical responses to climates where fuel was scarce and winters lasted 8 months. When Anders visited Lars's Wyoming claim the previous summer, he nodded approvingly at the dugout plans. "In the old country, we built for the wind we couldn't stop," he said, running his hands along the timber framework. "Smart men work with the hill, not against it." The construction itself followed principles that seemed primitive to homesteaders, accustomed to frame houses and milled lumber. Lars cribbed the interior walls with short logs and dry stacked stone, chinked tight with clay mortar to eliminate air infiltration. He cut a shallow French drain outside the doorway, sloping away from the entrance and filled with stone to carry away snowmelt and rain. The roof structure required 8 to 10-inch diameter lodgepole pine beams, strong enough to bear the load of 3 feet of compacted earth and sod blocks. A single window, 2 feet square, faced south to capture daylight and solar gain during the brief winter sun. Most critically, he dug a 6-inch diameter ventilation shaft from the back corner straight up through the earth roof, a detail borrowed directly from the smoke holes of native earth lodges. Tom Avery, an aging ranch hand who had scouted for the Army along the Platte, was among the few locals who didn't mock the project outright. He remembered ground-hugging structures that had weathered blizzards, while military tents shredded and frame buildings collapsed under snow loads. "Seen them dirt houses back on the Missouri," he told Emma Morgan quietly. "Never lost a roof to wind, and the folks inside never seemed to freeze." But even Tom kept his observations to himself when the other men gathered around Caleb's stove, joking about Lars's grave-digging operation. By November, when the first serious snow began to fall, the dugout was complete. The roof showed as a gentle mound covered with prairie grass, nearly invisible from 100 yards away. Inside, the space felt more like a well-built root cellar than a typical frontier cabin, solid, quiet, and noticeably warmer than the outside air even before any fire was lit. The earthen walls, plastered smooth and whitewashed, stayed dry to the touch, while moisture beaded on the interior logs of conventional cabins. The first test came during a mid-November storm that dropped 8 inches of snow and drove temperatures to 5 below zero. Emma Morgan, checking her own cabin's interior thermometer, watched it fall to 32 degrees by dawn despite keeping the fire banked all night. When she mentioned this to her husband, Caleb dismissed it as the price of living in high country. "Takes a real fire to heat a real house," he said, splitting more kindling. But privately, Emma had begun to wonder about the Norwegian's strange Burrow and whether his seemingly excessive construction might serve a purpose she didn't yet understand. The early 1880s had lulled the northern plains into dangerous complacency. 3 consecutive mild winters convinced newcomers that old-timers' warnings about legendary cold were exaggerated frontier tales. Ranchers left cattle on open range with minimal hay reserves, confident that their animals could paw through light snow to reach grass underneath. The free-range cattle boom seemed unstoppable, and men like Caleb Morgan expanded their herds based on the assumption that Wyoming winters would remain manageable. This false security extended to building practices. Standard homestead cabins, 12 by 16 rectangles with single-wall log construction and minimal chinking, had survived recent winters without catastrophic failure. Why invest extra labor in underground burrows or expensive double-wall construction when a simple stove and adequate firewood could maintain livable temperatures? The Norwegians' elaborate hillside excavation represented wasteful overcaution to neighbors who had weathered 3 seasons without serious hardship. But autumn of 1886 brought ominous signs that experienced plainsmen recognized. Cattle grew unusually heavy, coats by September. Migratory birds departed earlier than normal. Native tribes along the reservation boundaries began gathering extra fuel and food supplies, following traditional indicators that modern ranchers dismissed as superstition. The Powder River country braced for winter with the quiet tension of a landscape preparing for something beyond ordinary seasonal cold. The first serious storm arrived in mid-November, dropping 6 inches of heavy snow over 2 days and driving nighttime temperatures towards zero. Inside Caleb Morgan's cabin, the family's evening routine revealed the thermal limitations of conventional construction. With the wood stove burning steadily, Temperatures near the firebox reached a comfortable 60 degrees, but the far corners of the room registered barely 40 degrees. The single-wall logs, chinked with mud and moss, allowed constant heat loss to the outside air. Every gap between logs became a pathway for warm air to escape and cold drafts to enter. By midnight, with the fire banked to coals, the cabin's interior temperature dropped rapidly. Emma Morgan, checking her thermometer at dawn, found the room had cooled to 35 degrees despite burning nearly 2 armloads of split wood during the evening. Frost formed on the interior walls wherever warm, humid air contacted the cold log surfaces. The family's breath remained visible in the lamplight as they rekindled the morning fire. Lars Nielsen's underground chamber told a different thermal story during the same storm. His modest iron stove, burning perhaps 1.5 armloads of wood through the evening, maintained the interior at 55 degrees with far less effort than his neighbors required. The earthen walls, surrounded by soil that held steady at 48 degrees regardless of surface conditions, provided a thermal foundation that conventional cabins lacked entirely. When Lars allowed his fire to die completely, an experiment no surface-dwelling homesteader would risk, the dugout cooled slowly and stabilized around 42 degrees by dawn. The physics underlying this performance operated according to principles that frontier builders rarely considered, but that indigenous earth lodge construction had exploited for centuries. Below Wyoming's frost depth of approximately 4.5 feet, soil temperature remained relatively constant throughout the year, fluctuating only slightly around 48 to 50 degrees. This deep earth acted as a massive thermal reservoir, absorbing heat during summer and releasing it gradually through winter. By surrounding his living space with this stable temperature mass, Lars had essentially eliminated the extreme temperature differential that surface structures faced directly. The 3-foot earth roof added both insulation and thermal mass, creating a buffer zone that moderated temperature swings. Unlike thin wooden roofs that conducted heat rapidly to the outside air, the thick sod covering absorbed and stored thermal energy, releasing it slowly back into the interior space. The principle paralleled the heavy stone construction of European castles, or the thick adobe walls of southwestern pueblos, materials with high thermal mass that dampened temperature fluctuations. Air infiltration, the invisible enemy of frontier heating systems, posed minimal problems for the tightly constructed dugout. Where conventional cabins leaked heated air through dozens of gaps between logs, Lars's plastered earthen walls and carefully chinked timber cribbing created an essentially airtight envelope. The single ventilation shaft, sized to provide adequate fresh air without creating drafts, allowed controlled air exchange that maintained interior air quality while preserving thermal efficiency. Emma Morgan noticed these differences during a social visit in early December. Stepping down into the dugout's entrance, she immediately felt the absence of cold drafts that plagued her own cabin. The walls, instead of feeling icy to the touch like her interior log surfaces, registered merely cool, closer to the temperature of a well-built root cellar than the frigid interior surfaces she knew from winter nights in conventional structures. When she mentioned this observation to her husband, Caleb attributed it to the novelty of underground living rather than any fundamental thermal advantage. Tom Avery, whose experience included winters in various frontier structures, began to recognize patterns that connected the dugout's performance to indigenous building wisdom he had witnessed decades earlier. The Mandan and Hidatsa earth lodges along the Missouri River had demonstrated similar thermal stability, maintaining comfortable interior temperatures, while lighter military structures froze solid during blizzards. Those circular, timber-framed houses, covered with 3 to 4 feet of packed earth and grass, had housed multiple families through the harshest northern plains winters, using remarkably little fuel. The economic implications became apparent as December progressed and wood consumption patterns emerged. Lars's modest stove, fed with perhaps 1 quart of split wood per month, maintained livable temperatures throughout the dugout. Neighboring cabins, heating similar floor areas, consumed between 1.5 to 2 cords monthly to achieve comparable comfort levels. The difference represented not just convenience but survival insurance. In a landscape where timber was scarce and transportation difficult, fuel efficiency could determine whether a family weathered a long winter or faced starvation and freezing when supplies ran short. yet social pressure against the underground approach intensified as winter deepened. Visitors to the dugout invariably ducked when entering, reinforcing psychological associations with cellars, caves, and burial sites rather than legitimate housing. The structure's invisibility from a distance suggested impermanence or poverty rather than sophisticated environmental adaptation. Men who prided themselves on building substantial visible homesteads found it difficult to acknowledge that the most thermally efficient structure in their community resembled a burrow more than a house. January 9th, 1887, brought the storm that would redefine winter survival across the northern plains. The blizzard announced itself with a temperature drop of 30 degrees in 6 hours, followed by winds that screamed across the Powder River country at 40 miles per hour. Snow fell horizontally, accumulating 16 inches in less than 24 hours, while drifts piled 8 feet deep against any obstruction that dared rise above the prairie surface. This was the opening act of what historians would later call the Big Die-Up, the winter that killed 60% of the northern plains cattle herds and ended the era of open-range ranching forever. Caleb Morgan's cabin, like every other surface structure in the region, became a battleground between human determination and atmospheric fury. The single-wall log construction that had seemed adequate during milder winters now revealed its fundamental inadequacy. Heat poured through the thin walls as if they were sieves, escaping through every gap between logs and every imperfection in the chinking. The wood stove, fed constantly with split cottonwood and pine, created a pocket of relative warmth within 3 feet of the firebox, but the far corners of the cabin registered barely 25 degrees even with the fire roaring. Emma Morgan stuffed rags and strips of torn cloth into every visible gap between logs, hung quilts against the interior walls, and kept one family member awake throughout each night to feed the insatiable stove. Despite these desperate measures, the cabin's interior temperature plummeted toward 20 degrees whenever the fire burned low. Ice formed on the interior walls where warm, humid breath contacted the freezing log surfaces. Water left in buckets overnight froze solid 6 feet from the stove. The arithmetic of survival became brutally simple. Each day required burning nearly 3 times the normal wood consumption just to maintain temperatures that prevented immediate death from exposure. Caleb's winter fuel supply, calculated for normal cold weather, disappeared with terrifying speed. By the storm's 3rd day, he had consumed nearly a quarter of his entire wood reserve, leaving the family to contemplate the mathematics of starvation versus freezing as February and March stretched ahead. Other homesteads faced identical crises. The Henderson family, whose cabin sat on an exposed ridge 2 miles north, abandoned their structure entirely when the roof began sagging under the weight of wind-packed snow. They moved into their livestock barn, sharing space with cattle and horses whose body heat provided the only reliable warmth available. The Kowalski homestead, built the previous summer with green lumber that had shrunk and warped through autumn, developed gaps between wall logs wide enough to throw a cat through. The family retreated to a single room, hanging canvas and blankets, to create a smaller space they could heat with their failing fuel supply. Throughout this surface catastrophe, Lars Nilsson's underground chamber performed with the steady reliability of a natural cave system. The earthen walls, insulated by 48-degree soil that extended in all directions, maintained their thermal stability regardless of the atmospheric chaos occurring 8 feet above. When the blizzard reached its peak intensity, with outside temperatures dropping to 30 below zero and winds approaching 50 miles per hour, the dugout's interior held steady at 38 degrees without any active heating whatsoever. This performance reflected the fundamental thermal properties that conventional surface construction ignored entirely. The 3-foot earth roof, rather than conducting heat rapidly to the frigid outside air like wooden roofs, actually absorbed heat from the interior space and stored it in the massive sod and soil covering. During the day, this thermal mass released stored energy back into the living space, creating a moderated environment that buffered against extreme temperature swings. The surrounding earthen walls, backed by soil that never approached freezing temperatures, provided a thermal foundation that surface cabins lacked completely. Lars conducted a deliberate experiment during the storm's most severe phase, allowing his modest iron stove to burn out entirely, while he recorded temperature readings every 2 hours. The dugout cooled slowly and predictably, reaching its minimum temperature of 35 degrees after 6 hours without heat. Even at this low point, the interior remained 45 degrees warmer than the screaming air outside, exactly the thermal advantage that indigenous earth lodge builders had exploited for centuries across the northern plains. When Lars rekindled his fire after completing the temperature measurements, the small iron stove restored comfortable interior conditions using less than half the fuel that surface cabins required for basic survival. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth actually helped the heating process, absorbing and storing energy from the fire rather than allowing it to escape immediately through thin walls to the outside atmosphere. This created a positive feedback loop where efficient heating led to thermal storage, which reduced future heating requirements. The crisis reached its breaking point on January 14th, when the Morgan family's cabin temperature fell to 18 degrees, despite burning furniture and fence posts to feed their stove. Their youngest child showed the first symptoms of hypothermia, lethargy, confusion, and uncontrollable shivering that wouldn't stop even when wrapped in every available blanket. Emma Morgan, watching her daughter's lips turn blue in the lamplight, made the decision that pride and social convention couldn't override. She sent her husband through the storm to the Norwegian's Burrow with a request that no homesteader wanted to make. Caleb Morgan, his face wrapped in wool scarves against the cutting wind, struggled through knee-deep drifts to reach the barely visible entrance of Lars's dugout. Inside, he found a space that seemed to exist in an entirely different climate zone than the one he had just traveled through. The air felt merely cool rather than bitter, comfortable enough that Lars worked without gloves while maintaining his small fire. The contrast struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. Here was livable space achieved with techniques he had dismissed as primitive foolishness. Within hours, the Morgan family had moved into the dugout's protection, joining Lars in the underground chamber that had become the valley's only reliable refuge from the storm. Other neighbors followed as their own structures failed or fuel supplies reached critical levels. Tom Avery arrived leading the Henderson family, whose barn had lost its roof to wind and snow loads. The Kowalski children came wrapped in blankets, evacuated from their gap-riddled cabin before hypothermia claimed lives. The dugout, designed for one man's modest needs, now sheltered portions of 3 families while maintaining interior temperatures that surface structures couldn't achieve even when empty. The earthen walls absorbed body heat from multiple occupants and radiated it back steadily, creating a thermal environment that remained stable and survivable, despite housing far more people than originally intended. Outside, the storm continued its assault on everything that dared to rise above the prairie surface. But 8 feet underground, human life continued with a security that no conventional frontier construction could provide. The storm cycles that defined the winter of 1887 continued through February and into March, each blizzard adding to a mounting toll that would reshape the entire northern plains economy. Across Wyoming and Montana, cattle carcasses lay scattered along creek bottoms and fence lines, where animals had drifted with the wind until they froze standing upright. The open-range cattle industry, built on the assumption that livestock could survive prairie winters without shelter or supplemental feeding, collapsed under the weight of 60% herd losses. Ranchers who had expanded their operations based on 3 mild winters now faced bankruptcy as spring revealed the magnitude of the die-up. In the immediate vicinity of Lars Nilsson's dugout, the human cost became equally apparent as neighbors tallied their losses. The Kowalski homestead cabin, abandoned when gaps between shrinking logs made heating impossible, had suffered structural damage when the roof partially collapsed under repeated snow loads. The Henderson family's barn, which had served as emergency shelter until the roof failed, now stood as a skeletal frame of broken timbers and scattered shingles. 2 homesteader families had packed their remaining possessions and departed for relatives in Nebraska, unable to face another year in structures that had proven inadequate for Wyoming's climate reality. Yet the crisis also sparked immediate practical innovation as surviving families confronted the choice between adapting their building methods or abandoning their claims entirely. Lars found himself serving as an unlikely consultant as neighbors approached him with requests for advice on emergency shelter construction. His knowledge of earth-sheltered building techniques, previously dismissed as eccentric immigrant practice, suddenly represented the difference between survival and evacuation for families who lacked resources to rebuild conventional structures before the next winter arrived. The first emergency dugout took shape on Caleb Morgan's property in late February, when the worst storms had passed but temperatures remained well below zero. Working with Lars's guidance, Caleb and Tom Avery excavated a rectangular chamber 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 4 feet deep on the lee side of a low ridge. The excavation didn't reach the full depth of Lars's original construction, but even this shallow earth shelter provided thermal advantages that surprised its builders. Walls were lined with salvaged lumber from the damaged Henderson barn, chinked with clay and straw, and roofed with cottonwood poles covered by 2 feet of packed sod blocks. The construction process revealed principles that frontier builders had never considered systematically. Digging below the surface wind layer immediately eliminated the convective heat loss that plagued surface structures during high wind conditions. Even at 4 feet deep, the surrounding earth provided thermal mass that moderated temperature swings, though not as dramatically as Lars's deeper excavation achieved. The sod roof, built using techniques borrowed from prairie sod house construction, created an insulating barrier that prevented rapid heat loss while adding structural mass that improved interior climate stability. Tom Avery, whose experience with various frontier shelter types gave him perspective on the thermal performance differences, noted that the emergency dugout maintained interior temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than comparable above-ground structures during subsequent cold snaps. This advantage, while less dramatic than the full earth shelter provided, still represented significant fuel savings and improved survival margins for families operating with limited resources and damaged heating equipment. As word spread through the scattered homestead community, other families began planning similar emergency construction projects. The techniques required no exotic materials or specialized skills, basic excavation, salvaged lumber for wall cribbing, clay, chinking, and sod roof construction using methods already familiar from prairie house building. The primary investment was labor, which desperate families could provide even when cash for conventional building materials remained unavailable. Emma Morgan, who had witnessed the dugout's performance firsthand during the worst storms, became an advocate for expanded earth-sheltered construction within her informal network of homestead wives. She understood the practical implications better than most: reduced wood consumption, stable interior temperatures, and protection from wind-driven snow infiltration translated directly into improved family survival prospects and reduced daily struggle against hostile environmental conditions. Her influence helped overcome social resistance to underground construction among families who still associated such techniques with poverty or primitive living standards. The emergency construction program expanded through March and April as families emerged from winter's grip and assessed their situations. Lars provided technical advice on drainage systems, ventilation requirements, and roof load calculations, drawing on his combined knowledge of Scandinavian earth-sheltered building, Native American earth lodge construction, and practical mining excavation techniques. The resulting structures varied in sophistication and thermal performance, but all demonstrated measurable improvements over conventional single-wall log cabins in fuel efficiency and interior climate stability. Eli Thompson, a younger homesteader who had arrived in Wyoming just before the deadly winter began, observed the emergency construction projects with particular interest. His own claimed shanty had barely survived the storms, and he lacked resources to build a conventional cabin before the next winter. After spending several days helping with the Morgan family's dugout excavation and roof construction, Eli decided to pattern his own permanent home on Lars's original design rather than attempting conventional surface construction with inadequate materials and funding. The shift in community attitude toward earth-sheltered construction became apparent as spring progressed and families planned their rebuilding efforts. Men who had mocked the Norwegians' Burrow now discussed excavation techniques and sod roof construction as practical necessities rather than eccentric experiments. The thermal performance data, recorded in journals and witnessed during life-threatening cold, provided empirical evidence that overcame cultural prejudices against underground living spaces. Tom Avery, reflecting on his observations during the crisis, began connecting the survival strategies he was witnessing to indigenous building practices he had encountered decades earlier during his military service. The earth lodges along the Missouri River, the pit houses of southwestern regions, and the semi-subterranean winter shelters of various plains tribes all represented solutions to the same thermal management problems that had nearly killed his neighbors during the Big Die-Up winter. The techniques that saved lives in 1887 were not innovations but rediscoveries of knowledge that indigenous builders had developed and refined over centuries of experience with extreme continental climates. By late spring, the valley that had once contained a collection of standard frontier cabins now featured a scattered network of earth-sheltered and semi-underground structures that represented a fundamental shift in local building practice. The winter that had nearly eliminated human settlement in the region instead became the catalyst for adopting construction techniques better adapted to Wyoming's actual climate conditions rather than the mild weather assumptions that had guided earlier building decisions. Spring thaw in 1887 revealed a landscape transformed by winter's brutality. Cattle carcasses dotted the creek bottoms and coulees where animals had drifted with the storms and died standing in the snow. Collapsed sheds and weather-beaten cabins with sagging roof lines marked homesteads that had failed to withstand the repeated assaults of wind and cold. Yet rising from this devastation, the grass-covered mound of Lars Nilsson's dugout showed green shoots pushing through the sod roof, just as prairie vegetation had done for thousands of springs before European settlement. The structure that neighbors had mocked as a grave had become the valley's most enduring testament to survival. Emma Morgan, walking the perimeter of her family's damaged cabin in April sunshine, could see the practical wisdom that had once seemed like Norwegian eccentricity. The emergency dugout they had excavated during the worst storms now served as their primary residence, while Caleb rebuilt their surface dwelling. But the new cabin rising on their property bore little resemblance to the single-wall log rectangle that had nearly killed them. Influenced by their winter experience underground, they built with double-wall construction, heavy chinking, and a root cellar that could serve as emergency shelter if future storms overwhelmed their heating capacity. The broader transformation extended beyond individual building projects to encompass a fundamental shift in community understanding of appropriate frontier construction. Tom Avery, whose memory reached back to Earth Lodge villages along the Missouri River, found himself consulted as a repository of knowledge about indigenous building techniques that had sustained human life on the northern plains long before European arrival. The Mandan and Hidatsa circular timber-framed houses, covered with 3 to 4 feet of packed earth and grass, had maintained comfortable interior temperatures for multiple families through winters that regularly reached 40 below zero. Eli Thompson's permanent homestead, begun in late spring of 1887, embodied the most complete adoption of earth-sheltered principles among the valley's residents. Working with Lars as his primary technical advisor, Eli excavated a chamber 14 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 7 feet deep into a south-facing slope. The construction incorporated drainage systems, ventilation shafts, and load-bearing techniques that combined Scandinavian turf roof tradition with Native American earth lodge engineering and practical mining excavation methods learned through trial and error in Wyoming's demanding environment. The technical specifications reflected lessons learned during the deadly winter and validated through subsequent performance monitoring. The floor, cut to 6.5 feet below the original surface, accessed soil temperatures that remained stable at 48 to 50 degrees regardless of surface weather conditions. Wall construction used salvaged timber cribbing backed by dry stacked stone and chinked with clay mortar to create an essentially airtight envelope surrounded by thermal mass. The roof structure, engineered to support 3 feet of compacted sod and soil, provided insulation values that no conventional frontier construction could match. Documentation of thermal performance differences accumulated through careful record-keeping by multiple families who had experienced both conventional and earth-sheltered living conditions. Emma Morgan's journal entries from the following winter recorded interior temperatures that remained 15 to 20 degrees warmer in their improved cabin compared to their original structure, with fuel consumption reduced by approximately 1/3. The full earth shelters achieved even more dramatic results. maintaining interior temperatures of 35 to 40 degrees without active heating when outside air reached 10 below zero. These empirical results aligned with principles that modern energy efficiency research would later validate through scientific analysis. Soil below the frost line acts as a massive thermal reservoir, absorbing heat during warm periods and releasing it gradually during cold weather. Earth-sheltered structures, by surrounding living spaces with this stable temperature mass, eliminate the extreme thermal differential that surface buildings face when exposed directly to sub-zero air temperatures and high wind conditions. The thermal mass of thick earth roofs and walls creates additional buffering against rapid temperature changes, while tight construction prevents the air infiltration that causes rapid heat loss in conventional structures. The transformation of local building practice represented more than individual adaptation. It marked the rediscovery of construction principles that indigenous populations had developed and refined over centuries of experience with continental climate extremes. The earth lodges documented by military observers and ethnographers along the Missouri River system demonstrated sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics, structural engineering, and environmental integration that European settlers had initially dismissed as primitive architecture. The winter of 1887 forced recognition that these supposedly backward techniques actually represented advanced solutions to problems that conventional frontier building had failed to address adequately. Caleb Morgan, whose initial skepticism toward the Norwegians' Burrow had nearly cost his family their lives, found himself explaining earth-sheltered construction principles to newer arrivals in the valley. His authority derived not from theoretical knowledge, but from direct experience of the thermal performance differences during life-threatening conditions. When guiding visitors around his rebuilt homestead, he pointed to the expanded root cellar, the heavy earth berming around the foundation, and the thick sod covering on outbuildings as practical applications of lessons learned through necessity rather than choice. The social dynamics surrounding these construction changes reflected broader patterns of knowledge transmission and cultural adaptation that characterized successful frontier settlement, techniques that had seemed alien or inappropriate when proposed by a single immigrant innovator gained acceptance when validated through crisis conditions that threatened community survival. The same neighbors who had mocked the dugout as a badger hole now sought advice on excavation angles, drainage systems, and roof load calculations for their own earth-sheltered projects. By 1890, the valley's building inventory included multiple variations on earth, sheltered design, from full dugouts like Lars's original construction to partial earth berming, expanded root cellars, and sod-roofed outbuildings that incorporated thermal mass principles without complete underground construction. The emergency techniques developed during the Big Die-Up winter had evolved into standard local building practice, adapted to Wyoming's actual climate conditions rather than the mild weather assumptions that had guided earlier settlement patterns. Tom Avery, reflecting on the transformation during his later years, observed that the men who lasted longest in harsh frontier conditions were not those who fought the environment through superior technology or overwhelming resource consumption. The survivors were those humble enough to learn from indigenous knowledge, immigrant traditions, and environmental feedback that revealed which techniques actually worked when conventional wisdom failed. On the high plains, the hill itself became humanity's most reliable ally once people learned to let the earth do half the work of staying alive.